And so with that, I can introduce our first speakers. Um, so we have Max and Evan from Preset, which is a company that commercializes Apache Superset, which is a very really established Apache Software Foundation project. And I think many of you may relate to that aspect of what they'll have to say when it comes to working within the confines of a foundation. Max, also the original author of Apache Airflow, and so a very very prolific open source work. And I think everyone here will get a lot out of their experience. And so maybe I'll leave it there, hand it over to Max and Evan, and if you want to add anything more to your backgrounds that I missed, feel free to add.
Yeah, I'll say a few things to get started. First thing is I try to extend my weekend until today, and I just got out of an RV, a long trip. So I was on the road this morning in the wine country, and now I'm back close to home, but not quite there. So it's been a hectic morning. Evan prepared a bunch of slides for us that I'm very familiar with, going to recycle a bunch of slides. So we have a lot to say about commercial open source, about product analytics, open source analytics. So there's a lot to say here. We can do a quick intro, but I think the intro is already done on my side. So huge open source practitioner advocate. They all started for me when I joined Airbnb in 2014, where I joined with the ambition and based on the premise that I would work on open source there. So I wanted to recreate some of the internal tooling that existed at Facebook, where I was coming from at the time. So Meta was a bit ahead in terms of like big data. There were some really interesting projects internally there, some open source, some not open source, and opportunities to take some of these really great ideas and bring things like Airflow and Superset to market, but not to market, to the open source community. So it's trying to find a project community fit, and got lucky to get a lot of traction when I started working on that. And ultimately, I went on to start a company. So there's a time where I believe, based on the success of companies like Confluent and Databricks, the venture capitalists started to look at open source projects that are successful out there, and started thinking about, like, can we fund some companies in the space? And I think around that time, right around like 2018, 19, 2020, there's like definitely a wave of investment coming from the VCs looking to fund open source creators, really, or open source practitioners and projects. So that's a bit of my story. There'll be a lot more to say, but that's my not so quick intro.
And I just came along for the ride with Max is the short version of it. Really, I've been using open source forever, but I've only been contributing to open source by way of Superset for the past five and a half years, something like that. And it's been a heck of a ride. So maybe we'll tell you a little bit of the story about what we've built with, well, starting with Superset itself. We'll show you a little preview of what the product is, and then get into our scarf story some more. We already covered the intros. If you ever want to reach us, there's our, contact info. Feel free to reach out. But Max, you're probably most versed to talk to these slides if you want to give the overview of where the project came from and what it's all about.
Totally. So essentially, Apache Superset is simply open source BI in many ways. And something that's interesting about that is that we are very much in product analytics and try to understand how people engage with our products and how our product interactions grow, this sort of things, but really focused on usually company data, whatever it might be. So a lot of our customers are using Apache Superset to do product analytics, but really all sorts or any kind of analytics. There's an interesting parallel with Scarf there too, because we use Scarf to do open source analytics of a BI tool, which is kind of interesting. So it gets a bit meta here. Why open source BI? And what are some of the reasons why you would use Apache Superset? So if you don't want vendor lock-in, you want more flexibility around how you run things on our side. yeah, so deploy where you want. That would mean like potentially on-prem or, you know, within your infrastructure. Do all sorts of customization and the ability to contribute or be part of something bigger. But yeah, I wrote an article a while back. I think that's called Future BI is open source. So you can read about more about like why open source taking over the world, especially in the domain that we're in. We're super well connected with every pretty much database in the out there in the world that speaks SQL. So this is the subset of this, and it's Apache Superset itself is used absolutely everywhere. It used to be hard to estimate exactly how many companies might be using Apache Superset. Now we have more visibility into that. We'll talk about it in a moment. We have an advanced SQL IDE as part of the product. Superset is very much a call it data exploration, visualization, dashboarding application, but we also have this SQL IDE as part of the product. So this is our drag and drop explorer. So here you have a Tableau-like interface or traditional BI type of interface where you can latch onto a data set. In this case, it looks like a vehicle sales data set, and drag and drop things, all sorts of visualizations, visualization plugins too. So if you're not satisfied with the probably 50 plus visualizations we have, you can create your own as well. And this is the dashboarding part. So your normal interactive dashboard with little filters on the left here on top, and cross filtering, and these nice interactive dashboards that have come to be in part of everyone's daily work pretty much nowadays. So build dashboards, share that in minutes. It's all open source. So yeah, let's talk about Preset a little bit. So Preset is the commercial entity. So we offer Apache Superset as a hosted service. Interestingly, the letters of Preset are a subset of the letter of Superset. It's a little bit of a geeky play on anagrams or subset of letters here, set theory and stuff like that. We run the best, like simple, reliable, performant Superset at scale is essentially what we do. So the value that we add on top of Superset, so there is the managed service, enterprise reliability, scalable, enterprise grade, lower total costs of ownership. So we're better than anyone else at running our software because we contribute heavily to it. So we're able to run the software in a better quality, a better way, and a cheaper way than other people could do it. And that allows us to pass down some of these savings to the customers. And then we have all sorts of bells and whistle too. So I won't get too much into the pitch of like why Preset over Superset, but essentially it is like the most reliable, leading edge, most stable, but also cutting edge version of Superset with all sorts of add-ons and bells and whistles on top. Did you want to take it from here, Evan?
Yeah, you did well for having not seen those slides before. Nice job. So then, going into our use case for Scarf, there's a lot of things that as a community we wanted to get a handle on. Support being a key one. We never really had the insight before of what versions people are using or installing, or what the general growth of the product is, how many people out there in the wild are using it, and is it going up or down, all that stuff. And then of course engagement, which is where the company list that Scarf provides really comes in for us as a community. So we can kind of reach out to those people, whether it's in the case of Preset, maybe for marketing. We could talk about that a little bit, but usually it's more that we want to bring organizations closer to the project and help us evangelize it or contribute to it and all sorts of things like that. So the process of adding Scarf to Superset has been an interesting ride. And thankfully the Scarf team was there to help us through the first several steps of this. A lot of it had to do with the Apache Software Foundation itself. And for those who are not familiar with it, Apache is a software foundation that actually effectively owns Superset. They own the trademarks. They're the ones that are in control of the repo, and they're in control of all the governance of that software and how we run the project. So there's a lot of interesting protocols and red tape and things that we've learned about along the way. And one of their key things that they're concerned with a lot is privacy. So when something like telemetry and these kind of metrics come up, eyebrows are raised. And thankfully, Scarf had already done a lot of the pre-work here by getting a DPA in place with the Apache Software Foundation, which made our jobs a heck of a lot easier. Data processing agreement for those who are not familiar, so that we can safely capture IPs with permission.
I'll say a thing or two here
Sure.
about the Apache Software Foundation too. But I think in many ways they're the governing entity, and they make sure that everyone is behaving well around open source. And with commercial interests, at times you could have incentives in the wrong place, and they are extremely cautious of like setting up a governance model that prevents commercial entities from taking over the project or from running some sort of anything else that is not a meritocracy. So we have a pure, true meritocracy, and it keeps everyone honest and well behaved. Sometimes at the cost of like some sort of oversight and friction, but it's all for the greater good. One thing I wanted to say too is just like being in open source for a long time before using Scarf. There's always this tip of the iceberg thing, and then you can kind of see a little bit what's under the water, but you mostly see what's on top of the water, and you kind of guess what's under, and you're like, oh, is it 10% or 20% that's above the surface? So it's really, really hard to tell how well you're doing outside of just pure, simple downloads and anecdotal, you know, things, glimpses of things you catch or you hear at a conference that this company is using your product, but you really don't see much of what's under the surface with just like normal open source lack of analytics.
Right. And so to get something like Scarf implemented, to find out some of that stuff that's under the surface, we have to go through the consensus building process. And we don't need to go in depth, but if there's anybody that's watching this or visiting from an Apache project that wants to implement Scarf, we'd be happy to talk to you and tell you all about how we did it, where we did what we call a SIP, a superset improvement proposal, to get people to vote on adding the telemetry pixel into the product. That's key. Everybody has to be on board with it. And then some other consensus around getting other pixels in places in the NPM Scarf.js package, things like that. And we started spreading these pixels all over the place once we got the okay from the community. So we've got them in the product itself. That was probably the biggest achievement. But we also have them in documentation all over on our repo, on our wiki, all sorts of things. In the product itself, we just have a handy dandy little React component here. And we made it so that by providing an environment variable, when you're starting up the product, if you say Scarf Analytics equals false, then it turns off the NPM stats, it turns off the pixel, and you can just basically opt out of everything. So that made people pretty cozy with it.
We went opt-out by default too. So we wanted for analytics to be on by default and to provide the ability for people to turn it off. But I think if you do the other way around, it might seem more ethical in some ways, but then you don't really get to take a real peek of what's under the iceberg. So you're just dealing with different shape of or physics around the iceberg itself if you go that route. So I'm really glad we went that way. I would definitely recommend for people to have opt out as the default when implementing something like Scarf.
Yeah, and we had to make everybody cozy with that. So to do that, as I'm illustrating here, there's documentation all over the place. We were shouting it from the mountaintops that we were doing this, and here's how you use it. Here's the value. Here's how safe it is. All that good stuff. So what we've learned are a number of things, and we share these every month in our Superset town halls. So that's been a huge value for the community. One of the main things is adoption of versions of the software. So this is gathered by the in-product pixel, and we can see stuff here that 4.0 is our newest major release, and we're seeing that adopted pretty well. But we also see that 3.1.0, the last major, is still widely in use. So ideally, we want to get people to adopt the new major version, but we're also seeing in some cases that the patch versions are not being updated, which means people might be having security problems, or who knows. But this really gives us insight to go after people upgrading, and also figure out if there is a security issue, God forbid, then we know how many versions back we have to patch. So things like knowing the security fallout of something and also knowing the adoption of our latest releases is just huge for us. Again, this is the same kind of thing. And actually, what you see in downloads and what you see in the pixel usage doesn't always line up, which is something interesting. We found out that even though we're seeing more downloads of 4.0.1 by a mile, we're seeing a lot more usage of 4.0.0. So if you kind of have to look at both stats and surmise the reason as you will, but they're both equally important. And then, of course, general community growth is something we always want to keep an eye on. So just looking at downloads over time and seeing that number slowly tick up is just kind of a universal KPI everybody wants. And then similarly, we can use the pixel to just infer overall usage because it grabs every page view from the app by URL, and we see this spike. So we're just looking at very recent data here. I don't know why things were really used over this brief period here, but somebody went crazy. If anybody has theories, I'm open. But it's certainly interesting to see. And of course, in terms of troubleshooting bugs and things like that, we're really easily able to narrow it down by platform and browser and things like that, which is super helpful. And last but not least, this is probably the big hit of Scarf, is figuring out who actually is using this thing. And from where we sit as a commercial open source company, that can be a little sensitive. Working with the Apache Software Foundation, they want to remain vendor neutral, so we can't just like go spamming everybody or anything like that. But it is useful for us, and I'll say that much. And from a community perspective, we're able to find companies that are using Superset and reach out to them on open source grounds and just say like, hey, it looks like you're using this. What kind of customizations have you done? How are you deploying it? How are the docs working out for you? How can we bring you in to be a more valued part of our open source community? And that's been huge.
Now, I'm going to add a thing or two there in terms of
Sure.
what we look at and what's been useful. Like companies that were not using the product, last week or last month, that were using it more now. Also interesting is getting an idea of how many uniques are within the different companies, just to get a sense of like what are the larger deployments or the growing deployments. So this is extremely valuable. I think there would be even more value, and we've given some of that feedback to being able to do more slice and dicing, specifically around downloads, where like not always sure where the bursts of downloads are coming from too. So both Evan and I are excited to hear about some of the product improvement later in this session. So we're not just here to talk, we're here to listen, definitely. And we're excited about every time we get a new kind of slice or cut of data, a new metric or a new dimension, we're like, kids at Christmas around this stuff.
Yeah, and on that note, one last slide is that Scarf provides the data, the actual granular event data, in a number of ways. You can get it through exports, you can get it through the API. They've got their Postgres GitHub action, but if you get, in this case, a week worth of document pixel data on our documentation site, you can actually find out which pages are being used the most or the least, so you know where to spend that documentation effort. See just overall how things are doing, where in the world people are visiting from, and you can slice and dice this stuff any old way you want. And that's true for all the streams of Scarf data. So with a BI tool like ours, you can really get in there and get your hands dirty, which is fun. And I highly recommend it. And if you do want to try it with your Scarf data, please do. You can do it on open source grounds. Here's the repo, or you can try a preset for free. So please give it a whirl. Presets by far the easiest way.
Up to 5 seats free, so you can get quite a bit of mileage for a few contributor committers in your community.
And if you want to ask any questions about any of the above, how we've implemented it or our product or anything like that, please do just reach out. But yeah, I'll leave it there. We're free for any questions or whatever.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. That was really great to see. It's always weird doing this virtually, I guess. I don't know. If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in chat or just raise your hand in Zoom, and we can call on you and do it that way. And maybe while we wait, because we have a little bit of extra time, so maybe I'll ask one or two while we're waiting if any others want to chime in. So I think in terms of the really concrete data and metrics that you guys are looking at, you mentioned quite a number of different things that were of interest there. And I think the one that seems like it has a lot of applications is the version adoption. you mentioned the security, the security angle of wanting to understand, if there are vulnerabilities, like how far back do you want to go to patch these kinds of things, et cetera. I'm curious from the superset community side. Um, on like a week to week, month to month basis, what are the important metrics that you're looking at with version adoption? Like why do you care if people are upgrading, this kind of thing? And when you are seeing these bottlenecks, what do you guys do to mitigate them?
I'd say one of the main reasons we want to keep an eye on version adoption is to figure out how far back we have to support GitHub issues and things like that. We're always trying to come up with a policy of like, what is our sort of LTS version support? And we kind of change it very slowly over the years a little bit, but this sort of information that we have now tells us like, okay, is everybody on 4.0 or at least the significant population? If not, then we have to keep supporting our 3.1 issues to some extent, or at least the security stuff, but opportunistically more bug fixes and things like that. So we'll probably keep putting out 3.1.x versions as long as we need to until the critical mass is over to the 4.0 land or 4.1 comes out. And so this lets us know when that moment is and when we can go closing a bunch of issues and stuff like that, which is huge and feels really great. Yeah, and
well, I'll tell you, like one note is, we know very much like what is in different branches and what is, how far behind the different version or branches are, and that's something we can use as to see kind of how not optimum is the community in some ways, right? Like, and when we talk to people across the community, we ask them like what version they use to, and we get a sense for how much people are behind in some ways, and that shows the value proposition too of having like a managed service that is like the latest greatest version, yet most stable too. So I think that's an interesting thing. We get to see how far behind people are maybe in some ways too. That's a little scary, and I think we've passed the message in the community too, saying like, hey, you all need to upgrade to one of the LTS branches or to a later version, because there's some really clear issue in a lot of versions that people are still using out there.
Yeah, and in the past, it's also maybe worth saying that with an ASF project, it's not just like putting out a release and if it passes CI, it's released. You actually have to go through this whole voting process, and there's quite a lot of effort behind it. So we used to make those versions and kind of throw them out in the wind, hoping they were useful, but now we can actually tell if they're needed and if they're being used.
Got it. Yeah, that's really that's great to know. And I think a lot of other projects can probably enact things like this too. I think we see version adoption being a really key metric that folks are looking at both on the non-commercial side and on the commercial side. A lot. What we hear a good bit of is folks will focus outreach on companies that are stuck on old versions and might need help upgrading or might just need more support or guidance or just connecting with your community better. And there's, I think, a lot of opportunities that can be highlighted by seeing really old releases that are still in use by certain companies. Yeah.
I just had an idea that kind of talking about this, in mobile versions, they often prevent you from using certain versions you should not be using anymore too. That might be something we want to do with open source, to have a little thing as part of the software that's like, hey, you are on a version that is known to be unsafe and you might want to upgrade. Or it'd be great if we could put a comment about just coming to preset, that one would not be able to do. But I think it points in that direction too, to say like, listen, you're using a version that no one should be using at this time. You should be installing this one, this other one, or a commercial offering, maybe, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks in the Scarf community, I think, will be very keen to see how effective those kinds of nudges prove to be, and like what end up being effective strategies to get people to, upgrade in a more timely fashion, et cetera. And I think, Max, you said something that I think was very useful and important there, when it comes to the ASF, that there's a lot of these kinds of guardrails that the foundation puts up, but like ultimately the stuff is really in everyone's interest. And I think one of the really cool things that we've seen, especially within the ASF, Scarf now has customers that are direct competitors, but they work together to get this data hooked up and use it separately, and making sure that the community gets access to this kind of thing. And so I think one of the things that's been really commendable about that kind of model within the ASF is just how effective it is at facilitating collaboration between direct competitors, which I think has been really cool to see. Kind of, I mean, I know that Preset does not really have so much of that at the moment, but it's, you know, I think it really speaks to the effectiveness of that model. And maybe, I guess, one other question that would be interesting to hear. So you talked about the SIP process, the superset improvement proposals, and I think for the folks listening, what we saw the preset team do, I think was really, really well done when it comes to how like thoughtful and laid out the proposal was, and, you know, kind of trying to handle a lot of the objections early. Um, did you experience much in terms of the way, and did you experience many objections to the initiative before or since you did it? And what has that been like? How have you handled it?
Beforehand, there wasn't a whole lot. There were a lot of questions raised, and we knew there would be around a move like this. So what we did differently than several of our SIPs was actually go out and do a little kind of one-on-one thing, talking to people from different orgs using Superset and being like, okay, if we raise this proposal, what issues will you have with it? And we used that to kind of get ahead of some of those questions. So that's why you kind of see a very defensive looking SIP where it's like, okay, you're going to ask about privacy. What do you do with the IP, et cetera, et cetera. So we just got ahead of that. And there actually were almost no, you know, contentious questions left after that. It was a very quiet SIP for us, which is great. And people are free to rip it off if they want to use it in their communities. And and there hasn't been much concern since, except there was a moment, I forget the issue, but the ASF raised a question about the opt-in versus opt-out thing, and then they just kind of made my point, which we already discussed, that we think, you know, few people would use it if you had to enable it manually, but they
It would
seem to
take
be
the
okay
whole
with that.
effort kind of nonsense, right? Like if we
Yeah, so
by default, we're not going to go through the trouble. Like there's no need for us to go through the trouble of trying to put a pixel if it's not on by default.
Yeah.
yeah, in the end, they seemingly agreed, and they were like, "We've got a DPA in place and all as well." So
Yeah,
off,
there was some
on with the
precedents
show.
there too, right? So I think at the ASF they had some other analytics tools. What's it called?
Matomo.
Tomo was one that had been pre-vetted, and maybe they had already done some thinking around it. And then we're, you know, working with the ASF over the past like decade. For me, I know how to approach it too, and I know what they're going to think and what they're going to say, and and I know what we're going to say, what I would say as a member of the ASF too, because we are, you know, also active defendants and actors in the ASF. We don't always support everything in every single way, especially the things that reduce friction. Like some of the things around tooling might have a little friction here and there, and some of the things about like privacy first. You know, like sometimes it's like some of these things get put ahead of building open source software that it works for people. You know, really. So I think sometimes we're a little bit apprehensive of the whole process. I think that worked well. And if we were able to do it with the ASF, I think that breaks the ice for other projects within the ASF. But I think for any other software foundation or in any other community, I think if we can pass that test, then everything else after that should be cake.
Completely agree. Well, thank you both so much for sharing, you know, all of your experiences here. For any folks that want to connect with Max and Evan afterwards and ask more questions, I'm sure they're very open to doing so. Yeah, as a user of your guys' software and, you know, just a general fan of your work, thanks so much for presenting, and thank you for working with us. We're excited to be partnering.